Welcome to Julien Mascarade's podcast talk. We would like to thank our esteemed guest, Alasdair Trotter, for joining. From Oxford-educated strategist to global leadership advisor, Alasdair Trotter has built a career guiding Fortune 500 companies and high-growth founders through sustainable success. With deep expertise in revenue optimization, innovative consulting, and entrepreneurship, he has consistently helped organizations unlock clarity. Now, let's dive right in. Pleasure.
Good to be here.
Thanks for coming.
Oh, my pleasure.
We were just talking about Capital One and your experience at Capital One. I mean, there's so many incredible things to talk about, but let's start there.
Well, it's it's not the beginning, it's a beginning of a phase. I was at school in Oxford. I had done an undergraduate degree. I think I was like 2 years into the degree, and it's pretty standard. You know, you run off and you get an internship. So I had applied for an internship with Capital One, and there's a whole nother backstory about how I'd even heard of that company. But Capital One had launched in the US.
Tell me a little bit about how you heard about it too, because I know, how many interviews did you apply for, like internships did you apply for? Because I know
3.
It's different. Wow.
3 internships. So
nowadays you get on LinkedIn and you're like...
Yeah, this is pre-LinkedIn.
Yes.
So, you know, I was studying physics at university. I was doing, and one of the things I got involved with during my second year of school was what was called the Oxford Guild Society, and that's a key feature of my life because it's also where I met my wife.
Oh, wow.
So Britt was the chairperson of the Oxford Guild during my third year, I think. Anyway, cut back to second year. It's like an industrial society, best way of putting it. You know, so much of what you do at university and what I was doing was certainly either work, which was, you know, physics, or I was doing like a bunch of theatre, a bunch of sports, tennis, rugby, a lot of playing darts, just hanging out with friends, all that good
really
stuff.
Cool.
So
you didn't start out like finance oriented, you started in physics?
No. I was physics, and I thought at that point I was going to go be a professional physicist. I read a lot of science fiction growing up. Mm-hmm. I collect sci-fi now. But at that point, it was like, wow, this is a really cool opportunity to go study physics and then do a master's. And I stuck it out through the master's, but I realized toward the end of the undergraduate, during the master's program, that physics, and maybe it's just the way it was done at Oxford, but it's very heavy on theoretical math, very abstract. As I'm going through that program, that I wanted exposure, and I knew nothing about what happens. What most people go and do after, which is not further academia, you actually go and get a job.
Right.
So the industrial society was known at that point for throwing really great parties. Specifically, the chocolate and champagne party is the one that was legendary with all the Oxford students. And I somehow got involved with the group that was throwing that, and then somehow ended up running for a position on the leadership team, and I became the secretary to the guild. And then one of my best friends became, the president of the guild that year. So anyway, the Guild Society, one of the things it did was it put out a lot of careers guidance, ran careers events, put out magazines and that type of stuff. So I ended up editor for one of the Oxbridge Guide to IT. So Cambridge and Oxford coming together to put out a guide to help you find a job in things like finance, IT, banking. And I was the editor for the IT guide in my I think second year.
So it makes a lot of sense. This was definitely helpful for the future in regards to your career later on. Maybe you saw some individuals later, or this helped bolster your career.
100%. I mean, I came from a family where my dad was a general practitioner, doctor in Edinburgh. My mother was a nurse. And if you go back up either side of the family, it's all doctors, nurses, surgeons, or the clergy. So the idea of business was completely alien to me as a second year student who just assumed I was going to go be a physicist.
Right.
So part of what we did when you put out a magazine, the job of the editor, yes, you're writing and gathering articles, but really what you're doing is you're hustling to fundraise to make sure the economics of the magazine work out. And so what I was actually doing was, I still remember these names of people who I'd be calling, and they would be all the people who were basically looking to come to Oxford to recruit students.
So they taught you how to fundraise from an early age at university?
Well, I think what I learned was, a little bit dialing for dollars, with a little bit of a credibility behind you. And we had the Oxford name, we controlled distribution and access via magazine.
Where'd you get your lists to dial?
Most of those companies made themselves pretty aware to us. Oh. So we, each year, like a company like JP Morgan, BCG, for example, they're going to come recruit, 25, 50, students. And they want to get people as interns, right? Because then you can test them out, decide whether you want to make the commitment both ways, and then lock down an offer. So you cruise into your third year, because it's typically a 3-year program, already knowing where you're going to go full time. And I remember I did all the calls with, JP Morgan and Goldman Sachs and BCG, and we got, back in the day, it felt like a lot of money, £2,500, £3,000, £4,000 commitments from each of these vendors to buy a half or a 1-page ad in the magazine that we were going to put out. And that magazine was going to get stuck into the pigeonholes for every student in Oxford. So it was a great distribution mechanism focused on careers. And a lot of what they were buying was not just the half-page ad, but also the ability for us to then do an interview with a recent graduate on day in the life of a new analyst at BCG, just to pick an example. So the article was filled with these things. And one of the articles I got involved in writing and setting up was one for Capital One.
I like that, because you're actually going in the day of the life of some individual, so you can see, because that's the first question everybody asks when they're in the interview, and they're like, well, what does a day in the life actually look like when you get to start talking to an individual who's actually worked there for a long time? And that could change varying dependent upon the position, but it's nice to have that in an advertisement. It's good advertising. It
is. It brings a sense of authenticity and practicality, which is, yes, this is what the starting salary is, yes, here's our brand and what we do, but if you actually come here, you catch the tube in London into work, and you're going to be there by 7:30. So there's a little bit of like pre-signaling of like, this is an intense lifestyle. And I remember reading about all these day in the lives of, and they started at 7:30 in the morning, and they typically didn't end because email was just coming out, and so people would be excitedly writing about how they'd be checking their email before they went to bed. I think maybe that was post-business school. It all blurs a little bit back. It's like 20, 25 years ago. But I remember overwhelmingly that these places, they pay well, they really wanted to recruit Oxford and Cambridge undergraduates, and you were going to work hard. But
so tell me how you found Capital One.
So I got introduced to the recruiter at Capital One, who was basically tagged by Capital One to do recruiting at Oxford, and also to a couple of the most recent graduates. I remember the guy from Rob, who went to Balliol College. I think I'm still connected with him on Facebook and LinkedIn.
That's crazy.
So Rob had gone to Capital One the year before, part of the very first cohort of folks from Oxford who'd chosen to go to Capital One. And that was the first year Capital One had come to the UK, and had chosen to say, we want to pick up a whole bunch of graduate students into our internship and full-time program. So I wrote the article on a day in the life of Rob at Capital One, although I edited it, he wrote it. And I remember conversations with the recruiter and with Rob, and that was my very first sort of professional awareness of, a company recruiting, that seems like a cool job. They were really hiring, they wanted physicists, mathematicians, engineers, people who had quant backgrounds, because that parlays into the Capital One founding story, which we began to talk about right before the camera started rolling. And Capital One has a really cool founding story back in the late 90s. And it hints a little bit about kind of why I picked them or why they picked me. So this is a little bit of an apocryphal story, but I'll give you the highlights. So Capital, back early 90s and beyond, all credit cards were somewhat the same when it comes to a interest rate, right? You get a credit card, it's a contract that says you're going to spend, you'll pay it back, or you'll revolve your balance, and anytime you revolve a balance, it's going to be at a fixed interest rate, probably 19.9, maybe 9% if you're low risk and high risk, high risk and low risk respectively. What Capital One's initial thesis is surely there's a way to stratify that risk and figure out that maybe there's people who are super high risk who only get a 19.9 and a $500 credit card limit, and they pay a ridiculous annual fee. And surely there's something between that and the higher end prime or super prime type.
So it's creating
cards.
Different tranches of individuals.
Layers of strata, tranches, whatever you call it. So it wasn't just as simplistic as saying, maybe there's one in between. The Capital One idea was, what if you just break the entire population of everybody in the US and then later elsewhere into little units of 25,000 people? And what we'll start to do is actually gather way more data on them. For example, do they like cats, lighthouses, or pictures of babies? because maybe if we offered that on the front of the card or adjusted the creative, the envelope that the card, the offer would be sent in, this is all pre-internet, right? Maybe you can adjust the rate at which someone responds to an offer. Maybe you can start offering, what about 6.9? What about 7.9%? What about 4.9? What about a teaser rate?
And they would put these individuals into these separate tranches that might like, for example, cats. And they would send something.
Well, actually, one of the businesses I was involved in back then was known as the lifestyles business. And the whole idea was we were buying data.
I know they do that nowadays, but not to the same extent because, the commercialization of, sending advertisements out, it's completely changed. And maybe they were smaller at that point in time, so they were really trying to grow like grassroots.
Well, in the end, you want to acquire a customer.
Right.
So, I mean, what we did was we were buying data at the time that was based on a hypothesis of if we offer this type of image or this type of affinity. For example, what if we put your alma mater, University of Michigan, UVA, UCLA on the card?
How much spend were they putting behind that? Was it a large initiative?
A lot. So let me answer that by giving you a stat, which will be.
Yeah.
I remember someone telling me once, at Capital One at their peak in terms of direct mail volume, accounted for something like 1.5% to 2% of all U.S. mail volume.
Wow.
So that just gives you a sense. But the way we did it was super analytical. And back then we had there was a key metric, which was the NPV, net present value per mail piece. And at the time, first class stamp was 26 cents. And so if you calculate the probable return on should we send this piece of mail or not, and the answer was it's worth 27 cents to piece this mail out, that's a 1 cent profit. So that piece of mail goes out. So we would define the line in the sand at which any piece of mail going to a person with the right combination of rate, teaser rate, interest rate, annual fee, all these are variables. And you're trying to say, we believe that if we make this offer to that person based on their propensity to pay us back, to not be risky, or we can make a profit. And then you would bombard them with mail 3, 4, 5, 6 times a month.
So you were a business analyst. So was this some of the stuff that you were analyzing when you were at Capital One after your internship?
Yes and no. So my internship was as a project process manager. And then I did my internship in the UK. And I honestly don't remember exactly what I did for my internship. I think the internship in hindsight was designed a little bit to give them a project to work on that's somewhat tangential to the business, see if they're good people, vaguely smart, can string together coherent sentences, communicate well. Fine, now they get an offer. However, I mentioned earlier that I met my wife. She'd been a graduate student at UVA, done a year at Oxford, then had finished up, graduated, and got a job as like the sole employee of the society where I was just a student, volunteer leader. And we started dating probably early into it was probably between my second and third year. So she was around as we were finishing getting the magazines out, and we both did a bunch of traveling together towards the end of second and third year. She then returned to the US, and she lived.
So that's how you came here.
Exactly. So I those same recruiters I spoke to a year before, helping them, I was like, hey, you've just given me an offer to return full time to the UK business. Any chance you can make that an offer to the US business? And I don't think they'd ever been asked that before. And amazingly, they made it happen. So 2-3 weeks later, I had an offer in hand to go join the US. And I remember being very excited because even with exchange rate, it was like 30% more salary.
Yeah,
so
that's great.
It was and then I, was due to fly it. I think it was September 14th, 2001. And I remember when September 11th then happened because I had an American friend over with me in Edinburgh, and everything changed in some ways that day. Like he couldn't get back, and I remember
So were you even able to get over? What happened?
I was delayed a few days, and I was, I think, on one of the very first flights back over from London to
London. And were you going to New York,
Atlanta.
or where were you going?
I flew Delta, or one of the Delta code shares, to Atlanta with a transfer to Richmond. Because I remember landing in Atlanta and being interviewed by CNN as we were working our way through to get the connection, because they were excited to meet people returning back to the homeland after this incredible disaster.
Right.
And my focus was entirely on making sure I made my connection, because I was emigrating as far as I was concerned, which they thought was awesome. It's like a great testament to the fact that America is still an attractive place to be.
Tell me a little bit about that transition to Capital One. And you just got out of college. I know this is a while ago, but right, you just got out of college. What rich experiences did you get from that ultimately helped you crescendo into your other explorations?
That's fair. So, what I was hinting at a little bit earlier the Capital One founding story, and the reason I think that's important is back then Capital One called it information-based strategy, IBS. And they saw it as so fundamental to the way they made business decisions day in, day out. What does the data say? All we are is building better models than everybody else. We have better sources of data. Furthermore, we have a track record of having gathered data from 3 to 4 years that no one else can build. Even if they try to copy our strategy, we'll be ahead of them. Quite. Yeah. So it's a path-dependent strategy that builds a moat around the business over time. So I'd say lesson number one is that was the early days of big data. And big data went through a phase where everybody was talking that prior to AI, which is sort of now where the conversation is focused. But to me, the idea of making high quality decisions based on data, specifically more data or better data, is critically important and has been one of the themes I've written. And I would argue, if you're doing AI today, we're reaching a point where you hear about AI slop on the internet.
Right.
And we're talking about, well, why is one LLM better than another? And a lot of the time it comes down to, yes, weightings and models, but really it comes down to proprietary sources of data and training data. And while a lot of the LLMs are really, really great, the AI, the company that's going to win, say, in reading radiology, it's because it's got a better training data set.
Yeah,
and I remember, conversations when I was back as a strategist later in my career, to do projects, long-term growth projects for private companies who basically curated and developed data sets for training, and they wanted really deep thinking in terms of what does the strategy look like, for all players in the stack of AI. Like, who's going to win? Like, where do you want to invest? What types of training data are going to unlock massive new growth opportunities? Because we've got, training data associated with, mapping, geodata, there's data associated with healthcare. And it was like, okay, where are we today? What are the big unsolved problems going to be? Where's the growth and value going to be created 3, 4, 5 years from now? And what actions do we need to take over the next year? So I share that as an example of later in my career, the types of problems I'm wrestling with as an underscore of like that first initial lesson, which is, wow, the way in which companies use data to make decisions is like, you should know how to do that. You should understand how to plot charts and analyze charts and build narrative. And that's going to be my second lesson, is narrative development.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. I wanted to ask, how do you create that narrative in the first place, as well also, how are you going about looking at those learning models, right? Because I feel like most of the time I have an understanding as to what a learning model is, how it's utilized, and that over time it will make creating an AI model a lot more cost effective. But what's really interesting and what I want to understand from you, how have you seen big data change with AI being incorporated? Because now, when somebody has the biggest data set, that's extraordinarily valuable, but now the amount of time that it takes them to quantify that data has reduced drastically. So ultimately, what are you seeing change in regards to the quantification of data and of creating interesting stories and narratives using that data?
So I think there's a couple of different questions in there. Let me take them in turn. The first one is around sort of, call it quality and quantity of data. The other one's around narrative development. So take the quality one first. So I think, you're familiar with Moore's law, based on Gordon Moore from Intel, and the idea that the number of processors in a chip doubles every fixed period of time. Basically, it's another way of saying you can bet on the fact that processing power is going to continue to grow exponentially and it has done over a very long, multiple decades now. And I think it's reasonably safe to assume that our ability to deal with larger and larger data sets is something that's going to continue. We've gotten down to faster and faster. People are always crying wolf that it won't run for a few more years, but there's always a new technological breakthrough that allows you to consider thinking about how you might deal with massive data sets. So I don't think the interesting stories are about the size of the data sets. And yes, if you look at the development of the different LLMs over time, and I'm not an AI expert by any means, but I'm pretty sure that each successive generation of model that you see references the fact that this one now ingested 10x, 100x, 1000x what the prior generation did. I also think there's diminishing returns on just having more data. If you've already got 1 billion bits of data and you add an incremental, 100 million bits of data, your model's not 10% better, 9% better. At some point, you've got sufficient data to have a really high degree of accuracy, And whether or not the model is better, does it matter that it's better? Does going from 99.99% to 99.995% have any material value creation in the world? You reach this sort of point where it's now good enough to do the task, and a lot of people get trapped into, oh, but we can make it better and faster. But the question is, are there people out there who value the incremental improvement in quality that you're going to get? People do value quality to the point where it's good enough. People value speed to the point where it's fast enough. So my first point I was making around the quantity was just diminishing returns on value. I don't think that's a really controversial point. I'm not saying LLMs won't get better and will have 10x the amount of data in them, but is that new model going to be better because of more data? I don't think so. I mean, marginally, and maybe there's someone who prepares for it, but or will pay for it. But I think a lot of the growth challenges people have and that companies face, frankly, is because they overshoot. So we can go on a whole tangent on that, the idea of investing and creating quality that people aren't willing to pay for. The point I was really making is I used the word proprietary or differentiated and tied it to sustainable source of competitive advantage. So what I'm really saying is, what if you have access to a data set that no one else has access to, that gives you insight on something that no one else has access to? AI or anything like that, Capital One had access to proprietary data on if you send a piece of mail that's all white to this person, or a piece of mail that has puppies on it, or if you send this interest rate or this teaser, you've seen how they've responded in the past. Or if they already have a card with you and you're trying to decide what credit rate increase to give them, you've got data you've gathered on how they spend, where they spend. And we are still, in this day and age, only just getting to a point where we have good, high quality data sets and actual insights based on things like purchasing patterns and spend behaviors. Those types of data sets become really interesting. In my world of professional services, where I spent the last 20 odd years, I think there's really interesting questions about how professional service plays out over the next 20 years, precisely because so many of these larger professional services firms have sort of clamped on to clients, and they provide managed services, software, support, guidance, and that level of integration is so high that they're in a really unique position to actually have really interesting, relevant proprietary data from the client flow through their systems such that they can generate insights which they can then sell back as a part of their advisory or package services. And the really interesting question for me then is, well, any individual firm generates a ton of data, but it's a skill set to manage, store, filter, and develop and gather insights from that data. And a lot of firms will want to do that and will be loath to let some external vendor, particularly a professional services firm, have access to all their data and develop and generate insights from them, because that starts to get dangerously close to the client's company's form of source of competitive advantage. But I suspect what we're going to find is a lot of these vendors, whether it's the AI company, whether it's sort of the Accentures of the world, or whether it's the more of the classic professional services firms, start to figure out that they're actually going to have a competitive advantage because they can build the software once, deploy it as an interface into multiple clients, and start generating real insights. And you've seen the Salesforces of the world do this over years.
With Salesforce, how tight is their ability to share data? Because I always think about with AI, with CRMs, they could just take a lot of your data depending on the contract that you sign with them. Obviously, individual companies probably have different contracts than an individual does or a smaller firm does with these organizations. But I mean, they have access to that data at some point in time. It could be very dangerous if they don't get rid of it. Because then at the end of the day, they're taking your entire data set. They might be able to build businesses that are better, or because they take all the data sets from all of the top players, and they might be able to build a better business. Have you seen, or do you know of a lot of companies that are trying to protect their data in different ways?
Yes, so I think it is a consequence, and it's been happening for a few years. So this is not new, but I think there's unsophisticated and sophisticated companies, and the same on the professional service vendor side. And I think given the importance of data and proprietary data, we're going to see that ecosystem evolve over the next 3 to 4 years, and you're right to say it will be defined by the contracts that firms sign. I think some types of data, financial data, are obviously pretty locked up in terms of what can be shared, particularly public, company clients. And you're right, a lot of that, but that data does have to flow through the systems, and I think there will be a carefully drawn line that emerges every firm will draw it in a different place, but it will emerge over time in terms of what does the permeability of that interface layer look like over time, and what can be derived by your managed service partner vendor, and some of that will allow them to go create businesses benchmarks. I mean, it starts off with benchmarks, and we can provide you guidance based on how you look relative to others. And for that, we need to build a large data set from every client so that we can say, you're behind here, you're ahead there, and you might want to think about doing this over there. But that naturally then extends to something that's far more dynamic and interesting over time, because there's much more sophisticated insights that I think you can sell against. Right? You can start to predict, oh, you're going to have a cash flow issue or a payroll issue or a legal issue here, there, everywhere. And the service vendor will be much better positioned based on its data set and its ability to see multiple firms at predicting that stuff than the individual client. And that's a service worth paying for, but you're only going to get the insights if you open up the data.
Exactly. But maybe there's an area where they're hurting in their business, right? And then they'll open it up to maybe that area and only share specific data to try to help, instead of focusing where they're doing very well or beating the competition. They're not going to share.
I agree. And this is part of a broader trend where, again, we didn't get to that part yet, but the 20 years in professional services, it used to be an industry where we always, in theory, thought a disruption could occur, but we've now been deep in the disruption for 2 to 3 years. I think everyone thought, oh wow, we got some cost issues and we should absolutely use AI, and do we really need this number of analysts on a project anymore? People might have thought that was a short-term problem, issue related to the economy, or just 2 years ago. But what we're seeing now is, I think firms are realizing that no, this is systemic change. And I think we're going to start to see a massive leaning out of professional services, and I don't know what those firms are going to look like 5-10 years from now.
Well, they're going to go super lean, right?
They'll go super lean. There'll be a lot more AI, a lot more technology.
Maybe consolidating, too. Is there's going to be a lot more
consolidation. I mean, the firm I was with most recently was part of an effort to go private, and if you look at just the top 25 public accounting firms, just to pick that niche, you've seen a lot of movement in terms of ownership structures changing, acquisitions, M&A, as people start to realize you need scale. You need a diverse portfolio of services to sell in order that you can really build that interface layer over time. Because if you're a small firm and you sell one thing, you're not there 6 months later. So you need a relationship that's ongoing. And to do that, you need to have a team and a broad set of services. And to do that, you therefore need a minimum level of scale.
Do you feel that only offering a certain amount of services usually limits somebody's growth ability from X to Y?
Yeah, I mean, inherently you're stuck to organic growth, and organic growth is great, and the engine of most firms. A lot of these firms are subscale because they simply do not have expertise in a given industry. They don't have coverage in a given geography. They don't have expertise around a particular set of service offerings. And so, if you're a $300 million professional service firm or even a $1 billion professional services firm, you're wildly subscale at this time, because there's no way you can have the right expert with the right industry knowledge in the right city, because clients still like local, even if they're hybrid. You still want someone who's, you can call into your office to come and help with something every now and then.
Makes sense. I wanted to talk to you about Innosight.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about how that transition happened, how you eventually got to VC, because that transition is very interesting.
After Capital One, I did about 5 years there in Richmond, Washington, D.C. And then all my friends went off to business school to go do an MBA. And I'm pretty sure it was around about 2003, 2004 was the very first time I heard the acronym MBA. I knew graduate school existed, but the idea that one could actually go and study business, I was vaguely aware of that from my undergraduate days, but the idea that was this dedicated, 21-month program where you could go do business and it might launch it'd be like a turbocharger on your career, was a really cool idea. And I was late to the game, because the first I heard about it was when my friends were doing their GMATs and applying, and then literally half my friend cohort at Capital One went off to school one year. And I was left in the slow cohort who didn't, with either those who were sticking it out or who joined a little bit more recently. And to be fair, most of my cohort there had actually joined a year before me, and so I was playing catch up. And these are also the guys I play fantasy football with. But that's another story. Right. So I'm at this point where I'm ready to go do an MBA. And then through another random encounter, I'd met someone who went to Tuck, who lived beneath me in Old Town Alexandria. So I found myself at Tuck, and we'll jump over all the Tuck stories for now. Just as we talked about earlier with internships, it reached the point where I'm a couple of months into my first year at business school, and it's time to start thinking about internships. And one of the great things about business school is there really is a process for how you get yourself an internship. And I remember, a week before you start business school, you're updating your resume. Within the first week, you're having lunches every day with different firms who are coming to campus to present.
That's
and
so cool.
There's a big, sort of FOMO thing that goes on at business school. You walk into business school thinking, I don't want to go do consulting, I don't want to do banking. But then all these firms come and wave intoxicating presentations and, numbers in front of you, and they make it really easy. Just come along to our hours, just interview. And a little bit of like fear of missing out. You're like, well, if BCG wants to meet me, why not? I'll go have lunch with them. If they say send them a resume, why not send them a resume? It could be a backup. And it's really easy to get sort of caught into that. And I really liked the idea of consulting because I didn't really know what I wanted to be when I grew up. Mm-hmm. I'd done my 5 years at Capital One, and I thought maybe I'd go back there, go into general management. But what I really loved and connected with was strategy work, like the big picture questions where they're amorphous, open-ended questions related to, you're given this situation, what should a company do? And specifically within strategy, the strategy for how to cut costs and how to go do M&A. And what I liked was growth strategy.
I want to talk about that.
Competitive versions of that, and I was lucky enough to have some really cool professors. Rich Devaney, Sid Finkelstein.
So tell me, what would be a structure? Just give me a structure as in regards to a problem. Like, let's say you have a company, it's at $10 million. Dollars of revenue, and you're trying to grow it to $100 million in revenue, the financial services, because that's what you've worked in, so that makes it most relevant. What would be the other variables? And also, what would the process that you would go about trying to solve that look like in college?
Transported back into a case study interview at
it's archaic
college.
now,
so you
right?
get that kind of question. Well, this is still how you tend to interview people coming out of school. Right. And I remember, the standard way one would prep for these things is you spend a lot of time learning different frameworks, right? Sort of various decision trees to tear apart a P&L. It might be, Porter's 5 forces framework. And there's more frameworks than you can shake a stick at. And every business school professor and consulting firm has their own variant of, matrices or structures. So I'd say, I think over doing this for 25 years plus, I love having a mental model of a framework behind the scenes. But in client service work, the last thing you want to do in a real conversation with a client is be like, oh, let me pull out a framework. That's now what the internal strategist on the team might be doing with AI if they're no longer hiring a consulting firm. So for me, it's always a conversation, to understand what you might do, I need to understand where you've come from. So to me, my process would be, wow, I want to hear your founding story. And the reason why that's going to be important is, what I really want to know is, back to the roots, which is, what is the problem that your founder thought they were solving when they came up with their first product? What was the process by which they found product market fit? So how do you now know there's this problem and there's this solution and it works? Okay, how many people did this actually work for? What was the story of the first customer, the first 10,000 customers, the first 1 million customers? Why is it in this city, this state? But as you learn that story, what you're also hearing is the really important stuff, which relates to culture. Is it a growth culture? Is it a culture of data-driven decision-making? It is a culture of incredible salespeople out pounding the pavement. And these things are really going to matter, because the moment you have a growth strategy, cynics would say, well, that's at most, 49% of the answer, maybe even 5% of the answer. What really matters is, how do you now take that strategy and get the firm behind it? And that's a question of culture, process, behavior, governance, blah, 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 blah. And the reason why you want to know the story of where a company came from is because all the stuff that will help or hinder where they go next is locked up in the story of who they are, why they are, not what it is that they sell.
It's not what they did. That's the very. I 100% agree with everything you just said. There's nothing else for me to say, honestly. That was so well explained.
The framework can kick in now, because you might be like, well, how big is your market?
That was a frame. You framed that entire thing with all of those.
Well, I gave you a process.
Yes.
Your specific question was, how do you go from 10 to 100 million?
Yeah, that's a very, and the thing is, you'd have to have a bunch of variables out there.
But where I would go, and maybe I'll pick one, because this one is deeply rooted in the way I grew up as a consultant, which is back to that question of, why did someone buy your product? That's the hardest question for most companies to answer, because they'll describe the features of the product, and what they won't do is describe the job to be done that the customer is trying to address.
What problem are you solving?
What problem are you really solving? A problem that, and you're not allowed to describe that problem by using the solution, right? So what is the problem for which you choose to buy a car? Why this car? And usually it's related to safety or looks or an emotional feeling it gives you or a price point. And there's many solutions that could have fit that, but to really get at the core of why you picked the given car in this situation requires a much deeper set of questioning than most organizations are used to thinking about. Get very really deep there. So I always like to start there, because then you can start to say, okay, well, if you're 10 million today and your goal is to get to 100 million, either what you do today has legs and you just need to run.
Right.
That's like one category of answers, which might be, okay, well, you need to go from the population you've targeted to figure out where those populations are. Maybe it's a different state, different city, different country, right? But that's keep on doing what you're doing. But then there's a whole other category, which is, well, maybe you need to solve the problem that you're known for solving, but you need to solve it in a new way and package a different bundle of trade-offs, which will only then access the next 10x size of customers.
Right.
So you might start with a product that was actually good, but you've kind of tapped out the market of people who have that problem. But there's this other, much larger market of people who have an adjacent problem or a variation of the problem, but for whatever reason, your solution is locked from them. Maybe it's more expensive. That might be, but helping companies figure out what we need to do is actually figure out how to innovate and take this product to something that costs half as much.
It's like Slack. Slack was a company that was made out of, they were making another company, they made an internal platform, and instead of the company that they were making, they went ahead and used that, and it became
That's the story of AWS as well. Amazon built internal infrastructure to support what their developers need,
books,
and then realized, actually, this is what the world wants, and we can go compete with Rackspace and the others who are doing that and launch it and doing it at scale. So, I mean, that helping companies identify deliberately those growth opportunities. You often hear stories of serendipity where they pivoted and then discovered a new direction. And what I did a lot professionally in my job before this one was helping organizations in a more systematic and structured way look deeply at what they were good at, look deeply at their customers and figure out, are there adjacencies, pivots, redirects, places they could go where their customers would value what they did, would pay for it, and where the company was already halfway down the path to developing it. And that's another wave of growth. Now, so that's a second category of growth. There's thirds, and they get ever harder as you get away from the core of what you do. But a lot of what growth strategy was you spend time with a company and help them craft the answers to these questions, which is, who are your customers? How do you want to serve them? What are you really good at doing? Seems somewhat simplistic, but turns out the more simplistic the question, sometimes the harder it is for a large company where there's teams and processes.
So what problems did you want to solve? What problems that you found that you did when you got out of university, right? When you finished your MBA, what problems did you want to solve, and how did that relate to what you built? Because you also built a startup, right? There was a startup that you built. Was that while you were in university?
Well, I still haven't answered your last question yet about why Innosight.
Yeah, that's true. I asked too many questions.
No, I tend to answer by saying, well, let me set some context. So all of that was context for thinking about growth. So let me go to the startups by continuing the Innosight story.
Of course.
So I read a bunch of strategy books and did a bunch of classes as I was going through this first year experience of everybody applying for jobs and consulting firms on campus. And there was one professor, a guy called Clayton Christensen at the Harvard Business School, who'd written a book that had been really big, still is, honestly, The Innovator's Dilemma. And he introduced the world to a phrase, disruptive technologies, which that phrase hadn't been used prior to Clay using it. And those are pretty commonplace to talk about, wow, that's disruptive now. And that's, we'll call it the evolution or bastardization of the concepts he originally introduced, depending if you're a purist or not. And these were really, really cool papers. And we had to read elements of the book for the class. And then one of the managers at the firm came through to host a class. And what I loved about Clay's writing and those classes were the concept of disruption in business seems so easy to understand in hindsight, and if you're a startup, but it is completely impossible for a large incumbent to defend against, because when disruption comes at you, it is typically a technology or a solution that is worse quality than what you already offer. Think about the very first digital cameras relative to Kodak's digital camera. So you look at it and it's like, well, we do really high resolution prints. This thing is barely half a megapixel.
How's it going to compete?
It can't compete. It's crappy. Kids will want it. So why would we? And furthermore, and this is the most toxic part, is were you to actually try to embrace that technology, You'd kill your customers, kill your revenues, kill your margins, and you'd go bankrupt really quickly.
That's
so there's no economic reason.
Oh, so even if you were to embrace the technology, but maybe if you were to do it
who would you sell it to? None of your customers want it.
Well, why don't you build a small portion of your firm doing that and then allow it to grow over time instead of doing a drastic growth? It's kind of like Facebook, for example. They went so to the opposite end
With
to try
the
to
metaverse?
say,
So-
they shouldn't have been so focused on AI.
1,000%, I would agree. Now, I can't speak to the Meta
AR,
one specifically, augmented, right?
Right.
But I can speak to most companies. But so you've gone, and this is why I love it. It's so easy from the outside, or in hindsight,
It's
to
very
say,
hard,
why don't you carve off a small percent of your costs? But the moment you do that, and you've now got investors who are increasingly short term, and let's say you're a public
Right.
company, which is these big firms that get stuck. I can give another example, like Xbox and Sony locked in a war of PlayStation versus
Right,
Xbox.
Xbox, yeah.
What do their customers want? And you should listen to your customers, right? So
Right.
you go interview customers. More pixels, faster resolution, more processing speed, more online. And the big disruption in that space was not aimed at the core hardcore gamer who wanted a first-person shooter, to get better than Crysis on the PC, which was the benchmark at the time.
Right.
It was Nintendo Wii. Cartoony graphics,
Wow,
less
yeah.
processing power, but it innovated in a different direction and outsold both by a huge amount and made a lot more money for Nintendo. So
with an inferior product,
with
inferior
an
games.
inferior by the definition of the incumbents at the time.
Right.
And so it's all about what we call the dimension of performance, and the innovators often pick a different dimension against which to innovate. And you read case study after case study after case study of these large incumbent firms falling prey to disruption. And you listen to the interviews of those customers, they felt paralyzed. Their investors wouldn't let them go waste money on perceived startup projects. Their best customers told them, we don't want this. So it's a really hard strategy problem, but it's an even harder execution problem to go after. And then I discovered that this manager had come up from this firm, Innosight, and quite by chance, and he'd led this great class, and it was the classic story of Novo Nordisk and their insulin development program, which was highly disruptive to the incumbents at the time. Fast forward 2 weeks later, Thanksgiving dinner in my first year, and my wife meets one of my classmates' girlfriends. And she's like, Alasdair, you have to come over and meet this girl. She's super interesting. She works at this cool little company in Boston. And so I meet this lady, Natalie, and she's an analyst at Innosight. And I remember walking away from that party thinking, wow, she doesn't go to business school, but her job is way cooler than anything I'm applying for. Didn't stop me applying for them as backups.
Right.
And so she connected me directly with the president of the firm, and it's at 10 people, this firm at this point, back
That's
in
so
95.
cool.
And I write to them and said, don't suppose you take MBA interns? And he's like, well, actually, send us a resume. We haven't done it before, but we might take a couple this year. Fast forward, long story, they gave me an internship offer. And I start at Innosight, 6 months later for my internship in my MBA program, along with one other guy, Alex. So he and I were the very first MBA interns back in 2006.
So tell me about your cycle throughout that company, what you accomplished there.
Well, now I can hit on two topics you wanted me to talk about. I can hit on Singapore and ventures.
Yes.
So I don't remember, but I must have said during my interview that I was open to travel and would like to go abroad.
Oh, no.
So I have already gotten myself an apartment in Soldiers Field at Cambridge at the Harvard Business School for 3 months during my internship. A week before I'm due to pick up the keys and move down from Hanover, New Hampshire down to Boston, I get a call from the president, Scott, of the company. And he says, hey, Alasdair, you remember how you said you'd be open to kind of traveling? Well, we're launching Innosight Asia in Singapore. And if you'd like, you can transfer and spend maybe like half your internship out in Singapore. And at this point, I didn't have any kids at this point, and Britt and I did love to travel. So we packed our bags and, 1 week later.
She lived in Singapore with you?
Yeah, this is just the internship. We then moved back there full time later. But I basically did my first, 6 weeks of a 12-week internship, maybe it was 5 of 10, in Singapore. And there was one managing partner of the Singapore office, and it was just the two of us. He had one bedroom, my wife and I took the other. It was a 2-bedroom apartment above a steamboat restaurant on Tan Quee Lan Street by Bugis Junction and the big DHL balloon there. And we had an absolute riot. And the idea of Innosight Asia was actually a little different from Innosight Consulting. So Innosight Asia had a sort of dual thesis. thesis number one was, what we really want to do is build a portfolio of disruptive startups in which our clients provide the capital, and we will use this, call it disruptive, emergent, lean startup approach to go build ventures. So I spent my first 5 weeks using the theories of disruption to write business plans for different startup ventures, solving problems for corporate clients. So one was a company called Mira Courier, and that was a courier business long before Uber began, but it was basically anyone with a motorcycle could sign up to be a courier, and the idea would be point-to-point package delivery.
And this was
back
Singapore. When?
That's 2006.
That's incredible.
We did a healthcare company, we did an education company. One of my favorites, which I spent the most time on, was a company called CogSecure, which was using RFID scanning technology to manage shrinkage of inventory in the back of high-end bars. The idea is you check bottles in and out of a storeroom by just walking them through a door. It would automatically beep as it went in and out. So the idea that bottles wouldn't go walking off the back.
Helps with supply chain.
Yeah, total supply chain, cost of goods,
and there's a lot of growth there, because ultimately you could use that in any number of circumstances.
So that was the basic idea. So these are just like 4 or 5 examples, but it was intoxicating to basically get to write business plans. And I think Innosight Asia, which later became Innosight Ventures, probably wrote hundreds of these. I probably authored, 20, 25 over my time.
In regards to investors, did you build those relationships yourself? How did they build those relationships?
Well, I said there were 2 theses. That was thesis number 1.
Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself.
This is the perfect segue question. Yeah. Thesis number 2 was, we need clients, we need corporations who have problems worth solving. So we did consulting projects with large companies in which we said, let us help you develop a portfolio of disruptive startups that are growth, adjacent growth, or hedges against your core business. So one client was this large, call them transportation, delivery, packaging type company that's very large globally. And so we were exploring, they were really good at moving packages as fast as possible, but there's a lot of customers who don't want a package delivered as fast as possible. They need it at 1 p.m., 3 days from now, delivered in this lobby. And so I remember the pitch for the business we did, that was a courier business, was we will get it there on time. And this company we were working for, they were really good at moving things around quickly, but they had no storage capability. The whole point was everything would move from train to plane to automobile, and then be delivered.
RFID,
so we were like, well, we need a little bit of package. So those two didn't merge, but we built a business that just had a bit of storage baked into it, which they didn't, because all their systems were designed around as fast as possible, not get it there on time at a specific time. And that, it might seem like a small change, but little things like that, when the whole DNA of a company is wired to do one thing, are actually quite hard to execute. So that was just one business, but it's an example of, we do a consulting project. At the end of the project, we provide a set of businesses in which you could invest. But the worst thing companies are doing is launching new ventures.
That is so smart.
Seed, just provide a couple $100,000 of funding. That's like equivalent to them hiring 1 employee. Right. And for the next 3 months, we will launch this business, and we will then bring it back to you with revenue, with a plan, and they will have the option to buy us out at multiples of revenue or earnings once it becomes more successful.
In regards to the equity that they would get, would they have equity in the company, or
they
would? What was the seed?
But, so just to illustrate, these aren't exact numbers, but let's imagine that we said, okay, we're going to make this thing worth, $500,000 upon seeding, evaluation. You put in $200,000, $250,000. We're going to put in $250,000 of sweat equity. We'll split the equity 50-50, or 51-49, and that $250,000 they gave us will be the seed capital to basically pay for us as we work on. And our business was then juggling, which is we need just enough consulting to keep the lights on, but to free up the spare capacity to then actually launch these ventures. And the idea is we'd sell a few at pennies on the dollar, or on multiple of revenue, but maybe we'd hold on to some.
To get the ones that you really believe in to
some level of scale.
Yeah.
And lots of them failed, but they failed within 3 months. And that's a gift for an organization. They spent $250 to, not to say no, but to let's go test it. It turned out we've learned some things.
It's R&D. And it's all tax deductible, right? So they could write that off.
I imagine, they could write it down. Yeah. This is then, so I'm now in Singapore doing this. Cut a long story short, I went back to my second year of business school. I rejoined in Asia, but now with a 3-month-old baby.
Wow.
And life in Singapore turned out to be challenging. This was also during the Asian financial crisis. So companies, this is the type of speculative long-term growth investment. So companies were pulling back on that. And the reality of my life in Singapore a year later with a 3-month-old was leaving my wife and daughter in Singapore 4 days a week, flying to India and doing regular consulting 4 days a week. So I used to commute back from Singapore to Mumbai. And after about 6 months of doing that, I was done. That's not what I'd signed up for. I didn't want to just be a regular consultant. and I'd given up a bunch of compensation in order to get equity in the startups in which I invested in, which was a cool trade-off immediately post-MBA.
I feel like that might have propelled you and made you, I mean, like, you believed in those.
I did.
You would rather get the income.
Yes.
I mean, you'd rather get that equity than income.
Post-MBA, I felt pretty employable. It was a good MBA, and I felt like, I thought the world was falling apart when I, in Singapore, and I was like, I'm being paid less than I would in the US, and I'm leaving my wife and daughter behind, and I'm traveling to Mumbai to consult on topics that weren't necessarily I could see they weren't going to lead to long-term growth projects.
As well?
Well, we were picking up clients all over Asia,
okay.
and we'd found one, a very large industrial conglomerate based in Mumbai, and so I was finding myself traveling there.
These startups, how did you get the initial ideas for a lot of these? Were you getting
out of the consulting project with the corporate? So the goal of the consulting project was identify and write a set of business plans.
Got it, because I understood that, but from what I thought is that you already had maybe some of these business plans and you were presenting them to them.
No, what we do is, so let's say we go to the big parcel delivery organization. So what we'd often do, I'm remembering it now, we offered a program called the Hammer, 10-week consulting project. The first 3-4 weeks are identify big unsolved problems worth tens of millions of dollars in and around your industry with existing customers. The next 3 weeks would be draft 10 1 to 2 page business concept plans, and then at the end of week 6 they'd whittle that down to 3, and then the final 4 weeks would be build out 20 page 30 page business plans with detailed what would you do week by week if you launch this for just 3 ideas. And at the end of the 10 weeks they had the option of picking 1 or 2 and saying we'd like to invest, and that would be what we'd be hoping for to take it to the next level.
Why paying you the initial consulting fee? Was that because if you're building the business plans for them and getting paid a consulting fee, right? Wouldn't those ultimately be theirs and they own those?
Yep, they would.
But they would want you on to be the sweat equity partner to ultimately build those.
Actually, launching a startup is something
tough.
that is wildly different from most people's corporate role. Like, people wouldn't think twice about spending 10 times too much money on market research versus just walking out of the building and starting interviewing people if it's a consumer startup. So what we were very good at was being very scrappy and very efficient. And we could take a business to revenue if it was a good idea, inside a couple of months.
Wow.
Most corporate timelines would be like,
insane.
There'll be a 3-month planning phase and a bunch of committee meetings and then set aside capital and then another year. It's just slow. Probably 100 plus businesses over the few years I was
service, product, etc. They were everything under the sun.
Yep.
That's
whatever
really
the
incredible.
necessary business model is.
And it
deliver
was
against
you
the
and
problem.
who else? How many people were
By
doing
the
this?
time Innosight Ventures reached its peak, we were probably 15 people in Asia.
Okay, so sizable enough, so you had enough people to be experts in specific fields and help.
I'd say we were experts in the process of launching startups.
Got
and
it.
even then, they're certainly not as experienced as seasoned entrepreneurs, but we were good at running a process that would, now you'd call the process lean startup, always getting out of the building, quick back of the envelope modeling, a lot of customer interviews, a lot of prototyping, and we got really good at doing those types of things.
So a lot of R&D.
So I ended up, because I didn't want to be bouncing back between Singapore, relocating to the US, and it just so happened we had one venture that was taken off, an education venture. And then the whole point with the ventures internally was we wanted to provide the seed capital, sort of what would now be a seed round, but you wanted the real validation of a Series A partner to come in and lead the round. And some of these ventures we started off as a sort of joint venture with a corporation. There were others that we launched because we thought they were good ideas that the world needed, and now we had some capital to do. Right. So I actually ended up working on a venture that was not sponsored, coming out of the first half of our business, which was focused on basically building a Netflix for education. And this is before Khan Academy existed. And so we launched that business initially in Asia.
And what was that called again?
Guaranteach.
Guaranteach.
Yep. So I founded that business, then found a co-founder, and we reached a point where we had.
What was it oriented towards teaching?
It shifted. That was one of our pivots. We started off as a disruptive tutoring service and selling straight to consumers, but that was we couldn't get scale. We couldn't land the pitch. The idea of being tutored by videos in your
was it the cost
PC?
As well? Because you had to teach
we were $10 a month at one point. I think it was just,
it was a monthly model.
Yeah, it was a monthly subscription to unlimited videos, and we sold it as this is cheaper than a tutor. But trying to sell tutoring services, we try experimenting. Can you post on Craigslist? But people at that point they could understand it, but they didn't think it would work for them. So I don't think we ever actually nailed.
It's because
the product
nowadays
market fit.
everybody learns online, but the thing is that you had to teach a whole market to start learning online instead of in person.
You know, it's funny. I had lunch with, so our very first investor was New Schools Venture Fund, and I had lunch with the principal last week in San Francisco, and we were reflecting on the model wasn't way wrong, but it was definitely 5, if not 10 years too early.
It was early, yeah.
And we struggled with the fact that we launched and started to hit scale right about the same time as Khan Academy was there, and it was free.
Really? They had a free model at the time?
Yeah, you're familiar with that?
Well, yeah, Khan Academy. I used it.
Yeah.
I studied for the 7 and 66 at one point, and I used.
So I remember
the
meeting Sal Khan in a coffee shop in San
so
Jose,
funny.
and he'd brought a terabyte. Actually, it was probably a gigabyte. Who knows? It was a hard drive of all his videos, and he was like, "Yeah, take them," because we were just ingesting videos. The model was we would ingest videos from anywhere. A lot of videos created by teachers.
Oh, and how did
we
you
would
get
put all the metadata around them
to provide you the content?
We'd hire them. We'd pay $1, $2 a video. And so that a lot of our early funding went into seeing what would happen if you provide a small incentive to crowdsource videos. And a lot of these videos are perfectly effective. You know, Khan, Sal, like he drew his first videos just with this little light pen. And if you have a good tutor, a good explanation, and it's patient, and you could tag these things to quizzes that would go along with the video. They're all short form, like 2-3 minutes. And I think the pitch is still interesting. Thousands of videos that adjust to your learning style, build curated, custom, dynamically adjusting playlists based on the way you like to learn. Like I think the pitch is still pretty reasonable. But for whatever reason, we ended up building software around it that built tools for teachers so they could use it for homework for their classes or trying in the classroom, but not all, like at that point, classrooms didn't have PCs in them. Not everyone bought a laptop. We did early experiments with like Chromebook when it first came out. And
so wait, I wanted to ask why the transition from B2C to B2B? Like, was it because I'm thinking the B2C, the problem was you had to educate everybody, and that cost to educate would just far outweigh the ability to.
That was why we switched it from
revenue.
B2C because the reality is we didn't have enough runway and we weren't getting traction fast enough. And at some point you can think you've understood why, but all you know is it's not working, and you know you've got to pivot. So we pivoted to B2B. That was hard too. Schools buy much larger amounts at a time, but a school's selling cycle is 12 months. So we traded one problem for another problem. But we did hit some scale, you know, depending on, you know, creative accounting, we hit something that started to look more like, you know, 100, 200,000 a year in revenue. And, you know, we'd raised funding from outside of Innosight, which was great. So we had a bit of runway, scaled up the team, had, you know, 5, 6, and actually probably 8, 9 full-time employees at one point. A lot of contractors were doing work. But ultimately, I could see that business was never going to get to the point where it was going to be anything other than a lifestyle business. You don't want to support a lifestyle business on a team of 4 to 5 people.
Right.
And I didn't want to be a part of the leadership team for that type of business. And round about 2010, we had an offer to sell the company. I had an offer to return to Innosight, the sort of parent holding company, as a consultant.
Right.
And at that point, you know, my equity wasn't going to help me retire. Far from it. I had taken a cut salary for a number of years.
Right.
And while I wasn't ready, I still wanted to bet on myself. It was very easy for me to say, look, I'm just going to return back to the consulting model. I got some credit card bills I want to pay off. I'd like a little stability in my life.
Right.
There'll be more startups in the future.
I think that's very good, because a lot of people, they don't know when is time. And I heard from, this is generic, but Kevin O'Leary, 2 years. You get 2 years, and I know that's generic, but it's kind of right in some ways. You know, is that if you can't proof of concept within 2 years. Now look, let's say 8 months of those 2 years you didn't know what you were doing. That might be a little different, right? But at one point you need to find you need to find a way to be able to make the model work.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, you can feed these things indefinitely almost. You can
hungry.
find a way to, what if we just cut another couple of people? But at some point, like, you haven't found product market fit.
Right.
You're probably not going to, and we certainly hadn't. So it was time to go try something different. And I was lucky that I technically didn't really have to leave a company. I just had to step from the role I'd been seconded into back into the mothership.